All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the second Citizens Jury Forum, where we will share with you what transpired in the Australian Citizens Jury on Genome Editing. So I'm Nicole Curato. I'm the professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And I'm also part of the project team, and I will be chairing this forum. So our forum will be in two parts. The first part will last for hopefully around half an hour. These will be brief presentations from the project team. And I want to emphasize that the tone of presentations is quite reflective. These findings are preliminary, and so we're very careful in framing these findings as work in progress. So what you see on your screen right now is basically the sequence of speakers. And the second part of the forum will be dedicated to an open discussion with the group, and that will not be recorded. So Simon, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Nicole. Yes, great. Okay, well, thanks, so Eli and Ricardo. There's actually a couple of parts of this presentation that I won't focus on as much. So if we do use this recording, we're going to maybe splice in Dianne's if she likes her part better. Use mine from last night, maybe. Yeah, my part of this presentation is partly scene setting and sort of giving an overview of the project, but also along the way, highlighting some features of the particular design that we implemented and some of the implications of that going forward as well as we go. That Dianne and Stephen and Rebecca will sort of follow up on some of them and expand as well. So we've got the basic design, if you like, of the Australian Citizens Jury, so up on the screen there. But you're both very aware of this, and perhaps last night that was less the case, of the fact that this is part of a global project, and sort of stressing the links between the Australian Citizens Jury and the Global Citizens Assembly, of which this will be sort of part of the cases that will sort of feed into that global process. There are a few decisions to be made about the exact nature of those links. We can actually maybe discuss that during the discussion, if there's interest in that aspect of it. And of course, there's the driver of this to begin with was Sonia, who was here last night, and the objective of filming a documentary on genome editing, and the third part of that being a deliberative documentary dedicated to the deliberative process on genome editing. And so the design of this is partly driven by the filming dimension, which actually has some interesting implications for the Global Citizens Assembly. Now I'm going to move on a bit more quickly than I did last night, because I've got 10 minutes and I took 15 last night. So let's go through the main features of the Australian Citizens Jury reasonably quickly. So there's three phases to this particular project, with the pre, the event itself, and we're in the post-process phase right now. The pre-project phase involved sort of three parts. Dianne led the first part. Now, one feature of this case, as you're very aware, is that it's part of a challenge with the design that we've experienced, is that there's not actually a public conversation going on about genome editing right now. And the next couple of steps in this process sort of required us to sort of have some idea of what that conversation might look like, or the elements of that. And one objective of this part of that Dianne led was only one part of it, but was to sort of draw out the elements, if you like, the sort of dimensions of what needed to be discussed. And so Dianne actually conducted a series of 34 interviews with various experts, international and Australian, on genome editing. Focus was on human, I think, Dianne, but the content of that actually fed into the next part of the phase, the process, which we call the discourse mapping. Was based on sort of Q methodology, but also had a sort of a policy preference option dimension going to the next phase of the research. And this exercise was actually about trying to sort of map out in very core, at least sort of course preliminary terms, the main dimensions and positions that existed in relation to the issue. And that involved sort of a series of interviews with 31 sort of selected participants. The results of that were then actually used for the recruitment. So the map that we produced formed the basis for sort of a stratification, if you like, to try and achieve a distribution of attitudes or positions, perspectives, if you like, in relation to genome editing. And I just have a little sort of graphic to show you what that looked like in practice. So this is sort of a representation of those sort of discourses, if you like, and we've got some terms that are preliminary at the moment. We're sort of going to finalize them, but there's a spread of kinds of positions that two or three of them operated actually throughout in slightly different configurations during the whole process. Agnosticism, it actually sort of seems to split into different perspectives, but in any case, what we did is we actually had a pool of 123 participants that we could sort of select out 23 citizens jury participants and 20 control group participants from and achieve this sort of distribution, if you like, to get a diversity of perspectives. So John Dryzek and I would call this discursive representation. We've got some research to do to actually sort of evaluate the effectiveness of this and the implications of it, and that's some work we need to get on with in the coming months. And then, having selected the participants, we conducted a series of pre-deliberative interviews, and this was to partly get a baseline in terms of the positions before deliberation, but it was also an exercise in developing a sort of relationship with participants. So rather than actually having sort of a survey that was done individually, there was an engagement with members of the team in talking through the issues, and we learned a lot out of that process, and also got a lot of really important qualitative information about the perspectives and where everyone was at in relation to the issue from not only the participants but also the control group. So moving on to the citizens jury itself, we've been very frank about how difficult this has been to design for, and it's really, I really want to emphasize we've been a bit down on ourselves in terms of what we've got, but it's actually an incredible job under some pretty important, difficult constraints, and one of which is the complexity of the issue in terms of the design. And we've sort of tried to navigate the best possible outcome that we can, given the constraints that we're confronted, which we'll elaborate a little bit on as we go. But the process was actually preceded by distributing an information pack, which Dianne and I didn't mention Rebecca was involved in this. Sorry, Rebecca last night and Nicole were involved with and putting together. It was given to participants a little bit late in the process, and so that's something ideally we would have actually corrected. The time frame was very compressed, given a lot of things that were going on at the time. But the objective was to try and sort of provide some sort of baseline information before coming into the process. The first part of the process, and I should actually to acknowledge Kath was our fabulous facilitator for the process, who's here with us this morning. Was very heavily involved in the design. And the great thing about Kath's work is she's very focused on actually smoothing the way to a good deliberative process, going through the sort of stages. And one of those stages is actually having an introductory process, ice-breaking sessions. But the introductory session was also about actually providing some context in terms of what is going on in terms of the process, what are the expectations, and actually interacting with decision makers who were there at the opening forum. Unfortunately, I wasn't. I was getting a COVID test at the time, but the others who were there thought it was a really good event. Then the next morning, the next session involved what we're calling, Kath might calls it something different, but we call it group building. We've got a lot of evidence that demonstrates how going through a process of actually bringing a group together to establish the rules of deliberation themselves as a group really goes a long way towards getting not only developing an idea of what deliberation should look like from their perspective, which almost always aligns with our perspective of what deliberation should look like, but also sort of gives the group ownership. And Kath may want to speak to this a little bit in the discussion later on as well. So that was in the first session the next morning, and then we moved into the information stage, and this is a more standard feature of delivery process, and Dianne will speak to that a little bit more. But one feature here was that the experts who presented, a good number of them were actually present for the whole process and available to participants to sort of answer questions on the hoof and interact, which was really nice, given the complexity of the issue, to actually sort of have this sort of recursive conversation about the technicalities and implications and ethics as we went along. And then we moved into the deliberative phase, which is sort of broken into two main parts here, the preliminary phase and then sort of refinement the day after. Now, it's always a feature of these processes that there's never enough time to do this, but it was particularly constrained here. So Dianne will sort of expand on this a little bit in a moment. It was a challenge to do well, and there's things that we would go back and do differently next time around. And then another important feature of this was to actually sort of make it an event. And report the preliminary findings on the day to decision makers, which was done in the old Parliament House Senate chambers, which is a really Stephen will speak to this. It's actually really good that we have actually one of the participants here to speak to the experience as well. So in a moment. This was quite the event, even though sort of COVID actually kept those sort of crowds away. We had cameras there, we had decision makers, and were able to pass on the recommendations to them. The post process involved a post interview with participants. We did the mapping survey separately this time, because what we wanted to do in the post interview was actually to talk about some of the loose threads that still lingered, if you remained, and to see what we could do to sort of manage the sort of so the synthesis and the sort of the deliberation distributed in this case around some of the remaining issues that we ideally would have actually worked through. But the another objective here was to actually gather the information to feed into a forum with the participants who were happy to come along. We didn't have enough money to pay them to come along this time around, but around half attended an online forum to actually work through some of the issues and give their consent to the sort of wording or updating of the wording that was in the report at that stage. And we're in the process of finalizing that. We hope to have that report ready before now. Unfortunately, we haven't quite got there. There's actually a few complexities which we're trying to sort of weave in and do justice to, and we'll speak a little bit to that today. But the next phase this is going to feed into now is a population survey with a number of objectives, one of which is to benchmark the Australian population against the positions that we've observed in the process, to see if we can actually say something sensible about what does this mean at a sort of population scale. We had this sort of journey with these participants, pre to post. This is the Australian population pre. What does this mean in terms of the dynamic, the potential for public conversation, and the potential outcomes in that context? So it's going to be a very interesting exercise. I've never quite done that before, anything like this. So we're going to see how it goes. The other part is to actually look at the sort of scaling up in the legitimacy dimensions. Nicole is sort of working with researchers from KU Leuven, who are also working the British team to implement some survey work on those dimensions as well. So that's sort of an overview of what we did and where we went, and Dianne is going to sort of pick up in terms of the content, and we'll move into the findings from there. So over to you, Dianne.
Thanks very much, Simon, and amazing timing. So I have to keep to that now. So I'm Dianne Nicol. I'm a lawyer, but I also have a background in science. And my task is to talk a little bit about the subject matter, genome editing. And I want to just give you a few of my own personal reflections. So you heard from Simon that our task was broad. It was all focused on human genome editing, but we covered both heritable and non-heritable, therapeutic and non-therapeutic, including enhancement, and as well as research with particular focus on human embryos. And we also considered mitochondrial donation, given that a bill to make this allowable is currently before our Parliament in Australia. On reflection, it was indeed broad, and adding mito into the mix was probably a little bit too far. given that we'd done the expert interviews and we had quite a bit of prior knowledge, we prepared the pre-jury information booklet based on this and had it peer reviewed by the team and a number of experts. It was provided to participants, but as Simon said, it could probably have been provided a bit earlier so that they had longer to engage with this really complex subject matter. We had 7 Australian experts tasked with briefing the jury at the citizen jury itself. They each gave 15-minute presentations, which were followed by small group deliberations and about 15 or 20 minutes of questions. So the experts, one of them was a geneticist working on monogenetic diseases, which is where I think the promise of genome editing is really unfolding at the moment. A geneticist working on more complex diseases, showing where the limitations might arise. A clinician who works mostly with patients from lower socioeconomic groups, the lawyer, myself, an embryologist, and 3 bioethicists, one focusing on history and philosophy of science. And she was really teasing out differences between human and non-human interventions. We had a disability ethicist and a moral philosopher. On reflection, 7 was possibly too much given time constraints. But having said this, I would probably have added 1 more. Although we briefly discussed religious perspectives, we didn't have an expert in religious ethics. And I think this is particularly important in the Australian context. In terms of what the experts brought, only one explicitly stated their position as a genome editing advocate, and certainly none advocated for heritable editing. But you'll hear from Stephen that participants were concerned they didn't hear the other side, and we certainly didn't have a strong voice advocating against genome editing. And I think this raises an important question of the role of experts. Are they there to brief or to provide advocacy? In terms of the end users, the regulators, in Australia, these are the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is equivalent to the FDA in the US, as well as the Gene Technology Regulator and the National Health and Medical Research Council, NHMRC. NHMRC has carriage of research ethics, but also administers our 2 acts that are relevant. One of them strongly prohibits a number of interventions, including heritable editing with a penalty of 15 years imprisonment. And the other one covers embryo research, which is permissible in very limited circumstances, subject to licensing. So we really thought it was important to present these to participants. We had participation from each of the 3 regulators at the opening and closing events. And I think it was really important to have them on board. As for outcomes, these are still being processed, as Simon has said. And we do have some interesting points of disagreement, or not so much disagreement, about different views that are being raised by participants. But I want to give you 6 guiding principles that came from the deliberation, which I think were generally agreed. And I think that this is really a critically important outcome from the deliberation. The first was that, if permitted, the primary aim of human genome editing should be to alleviate human suffering, improve quality of life, and reduce childhood mortality. Secondly, decisions about whether to use human genome editing should be informed by adequate research to identify potential risks and benefits. Thirdly, meaningful consent and equity of access should be the overarching ethical principles. Fourthly, if permitted, both research into and applications of human genome editing should be subject to appropriate regulation and approval, including stakeholder and community education and input. Key terms need to be defined to lessen the possibility of miscommunication and misuse. And finally, the recommendations need to be revisited as technology advances. So, on reflection, there's no doubt it would have been useful to dedicate more time to the deliberation itself and to have, I think, probably a clear break between discussion and deliberation. Nevertheless, I think these principles are important outcomes. So all up, there are things I would have done differently. However, given the huge time commitment in preparation, the commitment of our wonderful participants and facilitator and team, funding constraints, COVID constraints, and the sheer complexity of the topic, I do feel proud that we've achieved the best that we could in the circumstances. And I hope that our learnings are valuable from your perspective as well. So that's all I wanted to say. I just want to hand over to Stephen Merrett now. Stephen was one of the participants in the citizens jury, and I'm really delighted that he is willing to give us a little bit of his insights on the whole process. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Kath. Yes, I was fortunate enough to be one of the 23. Some reflections on it was a great experience. So there are probably three things that I think were shared by the majority of participants that would have, to do it again would have been great. The first one was a more, and Simon and Dianne have touched on this, a more diverse range of speakers would have been good. The experts that were chosen were not only experts in the field, but really good at communicating complex concepts in a way that was easily understood. People were speaking to us, not down to us, and that really helped. But it seemed to be just a little one-sided. It was great that the speakers stayed on and you had the opportunity to ask an expert during the deliberations. That was great. But those who spoke were largely involved in the field of genome editing and interpreters being largely supportive of it. So we were denied the opportunity, or we didn't have the opportunity to listen to those that may have had opposing views. That would have helped, I think, with the deliberation. And as Dianne said, there was no the religious side of things, either for or against across different religions, wasn't presented, and that would have been interesting to hear as well. More time was needed to absorb some of the technical information. I mean, coming in as ordinary citizens, many of us, there was a really steep learning curve for many, if not all of us. The terms CRISPR and Cas9 were like, oh, that's new. And where have I been while all of this has been going on? So I think, again, as Simon and Dianne have said, the information pack was very helpful, but if we'd been able to receive that a little earlier, and perhaps with some, I don't know, links to articles or videos that we could have watched before we attended, that might have helped better understand before we started deliberations. The other thing was more time to reflect on deliberations. The time just seemed to pass so quickly, and that last day, time just seemed to evaporate. So there just wasn't the time available to us to tease out and reflect upon in any great depth the final draft that was presented in the old House of Representatives, which was a great experience, but it just seemed, it felt rushed, not enough time to deliberate. So that would have been something that, again, with the benefit of hindsight, would have been really helpful. A couple of things that really made the event enjoyable or just better for me at a personal level. The choice of venue, the old Parliament House in Canberra, now the Democracy Museum. It's a location with a long history of being a house of debate, consideration and reflection, and that really set the tone. It felt special. It had more gravitas than any ordinary conference room, no matter how well or better equipped. I don't think it would have had that same tone that was really helpful. Kath, I felt in really safe hands. The key facilitator had a good balance of authority, inclusion, openness, the process that Simon described of assisting us to set some ground rules and then keeping us on track with those, reflecting on the morning of what we'd done the day before was a good re-engagement and refocusing exercise. The deliberations during those, the facilitators and recorders at each table the facilitators kept us on track without adding to the debate or deliberation. They steered us without contributing, and the fact that there was someone there recording it left me feel free to really focus and contribute without worrying about, I'm going to need to take notes and say something afterwards. And that was good. And the freedom to disagree was something that was stamped across during that stage where the rules were laid down, or we put in the rules. The freedom to disagree was great. There was no expectation that we would all have to agree. We could disagree respectfully. And for me, that worked well. That's it.
All right, I think that's me then. Thank you, Stephen. I would like to talk a little bit about the findings of the citizens' jury and some of the challenges that we've had with interpreting those findings. So as Dianne mentioned, I'll just share my screen actually. As Dianne mentioned, we did have some areas of fairly widespread agreement within the group about the recommendations for the recommendations for how genome editing should be used, but also some areas of fairly strong disagreement. And what we've been working on since the citizens' jury has really been to refine our understanding of where those areas of agreement and disagreement lie. And so that the recommendations can really best reflect the views of the group as a whole. And one of the challenges that we've had in doing so is really that there's a lot of nuance that lies underneath the agreement or disagreement with those recommendations. So even in areas where there is strong agreement, participants are often coming to that agreement from quite different perspectives. So we want to make sure that we kind of capture this nuance and we report it alongside the recommendations to help with interpreting those findings. So one of the ways that we've done that is by projecting the positions of the participants onto this sort of discourse map that Simon showed you earlier. Now, this is an updated version of that map, which is based on the results of the post-deliberation survey. And so as you can see on this map, we have a few more discourses. There's 6 discourses that we identified. 4 of those discourses, so A, B, D, and F, are very strongly supportive of human genome editing, but with some subtle and fairly large differences in the priorities, the concerns, the considerations that are important to those discourses. For example, discourse B is very sort of heavily concerned with the social equity dimension, whereas discourse F is much more risk tolerant and much more willing to move more quickly into the development and application of this technology. And then we have 2 discourses that are more concerned, less supportive of using the technology. E is very concerned about discourse E is very concerned about the potential risks to humanity of using genome editing. And discourse C takes a sort of principled stance against genome editing, due in some cases to religious beliefs, but also just beliefs about how genome editing might change who we are fundamentally as human beings. And so what we've done with this map is to project the pre-deliberation positions and then also look at how those positions have transformed, if they have transformed, over the course of the citizens' jury. So I'll just show you here how some of those movements and shifts in people's positions have looked like. And as you can see, part of the difficulty that we have in interpreting these findings, and we're still in the process of doing so, is that people have moved in a lot of different directions. It's not all going one way, which we didn't expect anyway, but there is a certain amount of movement in a more permissive direction when it comes to the technology. We've also just projected onto these points different colors showing how the positions of the participants is related to their policy preferences, which is something that we also asked about in the survey. And another challenge that we're facing there is that there's not necessarily a very strong consistency or a strong relationship between these positions within the discourses and the policy preferences of participants. So that's something that we're definitely looking into and haven't quite sort of worked out the finer details of what is happening there, but yeah, we're still working on it. And these results will be reported as well in the report that's we're putting out hopefully next week. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so my turn. So we intend to organize and run a global citizens assembly on genome editing to, well, deliberate global principles for the governance and regulation of the technology. So just as human rights are a matter of global concern, so should the technology that impinges on what it means to be human. We intend to gather 100 participants from around the world, and we're working with Mission Public and Genepool, the film production company, to try and make this happen. When we started out on this, we thought we were going to be running the world's first global citizens assembly. We've actually been beaten to it by one that's being organized on climate change that Nicole and Simon both have some involvement in, although the climate change one will be online only. And so ours, if we can make it happen, will still be the first in-person one. Of course, the COVID situation will have a big impact on when it can happen. We still need funding for it. It's expensive. It will require several million US dollars to make it happen properly. And we do have a grant from the Australian Research Council, which has given us a few $100,000, but it's nowhere near enough to do it properly. We submitted an application to the Templeton Foundation earlier this year. And unfortunately, it was unsuccessful. It was a near miss, and so we will be reapplying and hope to do better next time. It will be a stronger application. We've learned a lot in the last year or so, not least from the Australian citizens jury. We've submitted an expression of interest for this next round, and we're waiting to hear back from them. There are some lessons from the Australian citizens jury for the global process. First of all, the issue of complexity, as highlighted by Dianne, means that citizen participants really do need time to deliberate complex issues, and ideally they also need preparation in advance. And I think Stephen mentioned the importance of getting materials in advance. And so we will do as much as possible to prepare citizen participants for their participation in the Global Citizens Assembly. How much should they cover? The difficulty in coming to grips with complex issues suggests that we might want to restrict the purview of the Global Citizens Assembly, perhaps restrict to human applications of genome editing only. But the problem there is that a lot of the controversy concerning genome editing comes in more with applications to animals and plants. And so from the point of view of the documentary film, controversy is good, and so restricting it to human applications only might not be so desirable. We also need, as Dianne stressed in her presentation, and we need to make sure that we do have presenters who cover the ethical, religious aspects of the issue as well. We do intend to foster links between the various national processes that are being held, including our one, and the Global Citizens Assembly. That might mean recruiting some of the citizen participants from national processes. The advantage of that is that they would come to the global process better prepared, and so we ought to be able to have more productive deliberation in the Global Citizens Assembly. The disadvantage is that it may skew recruitment to countries where national deliberations have occurred. It may also introduce some inequalities in the Global Citizens Assembly if some participants are more skilled up in advance than others. So we would need to overcome those possible inequalities. An additional link will occur in as much as the the conclusions and considerations raised in the national processes will be communicated to the Global Citizens Assembly, so the Global Citizens Assembly can use what the national processes have produced as an input to their own deliberations. And yeah, so that's about it. We hope to make it happen.
All right, thanks, John. I think we can keep the discussion fairly informal. I assume this will chair itself